Well, hello again, and it's time for the Gene and Ken Show. And this is a program that we presented at the GUM meeting, the Georgetown United Methodist Church. And they had 6 interesting questions for us to answer, and we're going to try to recreate those answers and give as much detail as we can off the top of our heads. And let's get started. First question, where were the first cemeteries located? And give some information about the smallpox cemetery. Well, there were plenty of family cemeteries in Georgetown Township, in no particular order by their establishment, but this is the one in extreme southern Georgetown on Jackson Street, and it's called the Handley Cemetery. And those people who lived out in Shack Huddle, this is the area that they might use for burials. One of the most interesting burials in Handley to us is the fact that James Garfield's brother, Thomas, President James Garfield's brother, is buried there along with his family, and this is a photograph of his gravestone, and a book that's now available out at Jamestown Library. And it was located right down here in the corner, and next to it was the Handley Chapel that became Handley Christian Reformed Church today, and is located on the other side of the road.
I believe that is 4th Avenue running north out there.
Right here is 4th Avenue, right. And Shack Huddle School is there, and we'll talk more about schools at a later set. The Lowing Family Cemetery, this is located at the end of 28th Avenue. And it was established by Holden Lowing back in the 1860s or so. It actually materialized out of a little family dispute between brother Stephen Lowing and Holden. Holden was a surveyor and knew about the rules of laying out the roads and so on. He was responsible for surveying some of them. And when it came time, 28th Avenue had been established, but Holden had an idea: why don't we continue to take 28th Avenue all the way up to Stevens Sawmill at Ohio Docks.
At 28th Street and the river, or just off in Fillmore.
Right. And Stephen, for some reason, said, no, I don't want to do that. And the advantage for him would have been that hauling logs from the interior straight up would have been a good idea, I think. But for some reason, Stephen said no. In 1861, at the beginning of the Civil War, Stephen became active in the area as a lieutenant and helped train a group of farmer boys, to go off to fight the Civil War. They practiced actually up here in the fields around Ohio Docks, and so he went off to war with the 3rd Michigan Regiment, and he was going to be Company I, but it ended up being a different letter, like Company H. But they formed and then marched down Cottonwood through Granville all the way into Grand Rapids to board the train to go with the 3rd to Washington, D.C. That's where that group was stationed to protect the Capitol. And Holden stayed back, kept the businesses going. And when Stephen got back from the war, he said to Holden, "Hey, you remember that idea of building 28th Street all the way through?" And Holden said, "Sure." And Stephen said, "Well, let's do that." And for some unknown reason, Holden decided that wasn't going to happen. And so it said that a person who passed by his house on Bower Road, and Holden had a rule that if you came to his house at the end of the day traveling, you could stay for free and have a breakfast. Kind of the bed and breakfast idea way back then. Unfortunately, one of them died. And Holden, knowing that a road could not be built through a cemetery, established a cemetery right here at the end of 28th Avenue where it is today. And so 28th Avenue's progressed wherever it was going to go and never went anywhere. And today we have this cemetery maintained by the Loring family as their family cemetery, and it still stops the road. This is what it looked like back in the 50s, and you can see it really hasn't changed that much, and they have their memorial stone there as well. Another cemetery, and this one was on a farmer's back lot for a small family cemetery. It was located off from 12th Avenue on Voss Street and 10th Avenue. And in its day, it had only a few markers until the 1870s and 80s when a smallpox epidemic came to town. It was a national epidemic, and they did not understand how smallpox disease could be passed or transmitted from one person to another, so everyone was a little nervous if you happened to die of smallpox where you should be buried. And it was decided that they would use this small cemetery, Norhouse, I believe, and so anyone dying of smallpox or anyone in the area could be buried there, and that continued, but fell into discare because no one was taking care of it until a developer decided that property could be used for building duplexes. When that happened, then to keep the project going, he deeded over a small section of that area. We have affidavits available at the museum to tell the story from people's memories of where exactly the cemetery was, because no one was recording where that cemetery was, even in the 1930s assessment of local cemeteries done as a WPA project. It didn't get listed, but it was there, and people knew that it was there. And our group put on the property around it a fence and also a memorial stone. But because it was in everyone's backyard of that area, it was difficult to keep up, and we decided that we would move the memorial stone here to the museum, where it could be more easily visited by anyone interested and the family.
The smallpox epidemic, they were treated like the leper colonies of old. They were isolated there. As soon as they caught the disease, they were immediately sent there, basically to die and not to come back. Now, in 1918, they had the flu epidemic. They did the same thing. They put people there, as an isolation. Although the flu wasn't nearly as deadly as the smallpox, people still were afraid to bring the people home, although we have no records of any people from the flu dying there. My grandpa worked there in 1918, as he lived just north of that on Baldwin. He would go during the day and help care for these people. But according to him, that nobody that he was aware of died there from the flu epidemic.
And for smallpox, people were quarantined.
Yes.
If you recovered, that was great, but if you died, you would not be allowed to be buried in the regular Georgetown Cemetery, and that's why this cemetery, which does not officially exist today,
Not legally exist.
is not cared for by anyone but the property owner that surrounds it, and but that's where it was. The Georgetown Township Cemetery was established, and some of the earliest tombstones are here in the front along 28th Avenue. They have a nice display of men who died in World War II and that were living here in Georgetown Township, and they've just recently set up a small amphitheater for ceremonies that could happen out there at the cemetery, and this has grown into a large township cemetery, and they provide the perpetual care. The Hare Cemetery was established by John Hare here along the river. John Hare had a river landing and sawmill, and people from this area were buried when they died at the Hare Cemetery, and I'm trying to see 1851, the the Hare Cemetery was established, and the large stone that is there is actually a monument for John Hare's father, who had come to live with him at a neighboring farm, and so that's not the John Hare that established Hare Cemetery's grave, which happens to be in Grand Rapids. His grave is in Grand Rapids, but this is his father's. There are a number of other farmers that are buried, and the families have yet today kept working to keep the plot somewhat clean, and there's an association of descendants and locals who have family members buried there that are continuing to take care of it. The Shack Huddle Cemetery is kind of a really small, quiet one that most people don't even know about. But up on the hill, here across from McClellan Street, are a couple of graves. And here are the stones. And Shack Huddle School is there yet today. And here's a photograph of it being rebuilt at one time. After it was wooden and it burned, and they rebuilt it with brick, and and then modernized. So Shack Huddle Cemetery, quite close to the Hanley Cemetery. And another cemetery is the Jennison Cemetery. That's at the end of 8th Avenue in Port Sheldon. And that was established by the Jennison family, and they yet today take care of that cemetery. Lucius and Lumen, in 1892, a few years before their death in 1899, purchased the stones to make this mausoleum, which stands yet today, and we have a photograph of what it looks like inside, and all of it marble, and the Lucius and Lumen are laying there. And the rest of the cemetery, if you were a Jensen family member, you could get buried there, or close relatives and a few friends. But you can see there's a number of stones.
And we don't really know the exact history of why it was put at the end of 8th Avenue, like we do of the Lowing Cemetery that was placed at the end of 28. Now, whether there was some sort of a feud and they didn't want to proceed with 8th Avenue, we really don't know that background, like we do the Lowings.
To get into the cemetery, there is this, yet today, an ornate gate. Unfortunately, people sometimes forget to stop at the end of 8th Avenue, and it has been taken down a couple of times by automobiles that go through the guardrail.